Thank you, Andreas. So 3 really interesting presentations there, and I think really lots of complementarity, lots of connections between them. Thinking about the ways in which some of those horizontal connections are working as well. So people are empowered to do things with other people, as well as talking to government or government talking to them. But also ways in which you can build some of these structures in, so ways in which you can create different sorts of conversations, understand what people are thinking in different ways. So I'm sure that there are questions for our 3 excellent presenters. Can I ask if you do want to have a question? The gentleman over there. Well, actually, there's lots of questions. Okay, right. So we've got 15 minutes for this. We'll try and keep it tight. Let's start over here.
Thanks. Great presentations. I have a question to the first 2 presenters. And I think by now we all know that kind of deliberation really changes people's opinions, so it's well established and documented fact. The question is how it relates to the broader audience. You said that it helped to galvanize a referendum, but you would expect these people were not treated with deliberation. So, and the same is in African cases. So when you had small sample of people who kind of change their opinion. When they go back, you still expect the same forces at play, basically, either in referendums. The traditional political parties will try to kind of to argue for their points, or in these communities you would have people who are so still how you see this link between people who get your treatment, deliberation, and broader constituency.
Great question. Thank you very much. I'm going to take a few and then we'll come back. One down here and oh my goodness. Right. Okay. This is great. I don't normally get this sort of response from Rim. Fantastic.
Hi. Thanks a lot to all of the 3. They were really interesting examples. I have a question for Jane, actually, around what makes a difference. I think the question is basically what differentiates the citizen assembly initiatives and what made it successful, as opposed to a variety of different other grassroots initiatives that work with citizens in different levels. I suspect it has to do with your methods, but I also suspect that it's much more likely that the critical success factors that actually drew the attention of the politicians had to do more with the reputation of the organizers or with the kind of preparatory processes and so on. So what is it that makes this this process visible and influential in the end?
Okay, and one more, I think, yes, here.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentations, all 3, and I'm reinforced further in my opinion that the things they are very much context specific. So we're speaking about the situations, and they need to be speak from our context perspective. Now the questions, and my questions also to the first 2 presenters. I'm wondering about the process of democracy within your extended democracy. Now, what specifically? The people you collected, I'm sure they were different people, and they must have had different opinions. I'm wondering, how did you arrive to the final set of issues? How did you arrive to the agreements? You selected 43 or 44. How did you arrive to those 44 within your context? And a similar question in Africa. How do you identify these themes or the initiatives that you wanted to take further from your process? Thank you.
Okay, there are 3 great questions. I'm going to ask Jane and Nathan to give a brief answer on the process, but I'm sure there'll be lots of opportunity to go into the process directly with them, either at tables during the discussion or afterwards as well. But 3 really good questions. How did it work? What was the special sauce in Ireland that made it work? And how do you manage when only a small number of people are ever going to be able to taste that special sauce?
Okay, thanks a million. So some great questions. So yeah, the literature is actually full of questions about, it's all very well, you get changes in the 100 people who go. So you get the changes in the mini-public, but what about the maxi-public? What about the citizens overall? And we've just started kind of work on that, but we have a couple of papers out. And one of the keys is, of course, the communication of it. So part of it actually has to be the media. And do you get the media attention? Do you get it on TV? And so on. And like we did things like live stream. We had better and worse websites depending on which process and the budget and so on. But I think the fact that the politicians were involved, especially in the first one, The fact that they were very contentious subjects that were the subject of a lot of debate meant that the broadcasters turned up, they live streamed the plenary sessions, they weren't allowed into the roundtable deliberations, the newspaper journalists turned up, the journalists changed their minds, a lot had been very skeptical. So as a result, that's why we saw in the end, like 78% of people knew about it, they were able to answer really detailed knowledge questions about it, and these were people who weren't there. And so the only thing really is, you know, the amount of kind of media exposure that happened. And in terms of making it visible, well, that media exposure is kind of afterwards, but beforehand it was the working with the government and the civil servants. So a lot of others, there was numerous other groups you can imagine from civil society when Ireland was in such a crisis, but a lot of them kind of did their own thing and then just did reports and fed it in. So we went to a lot of effort to actually talk to civil servants and talk to politicians. And then in terms of the issues, what happened was the government decided on a small number of issues, but the people didn't really like that. So one of the key things was that this was over numerous weekends, so it gave them time to have control over the process, to ask for which experts they would like, to really be able to interrogate the experts and so on. And so that's why it went from kind of 10 issues that the government asked them to give opinion on to sort of 44 that they decided to give their opinion on. And that's because they were actually given quite a lot of power within the process and time.
Thank you so much. I'll begin with the last question on how we identified the final opinions to present to the citizens. One is the first step in this is, as I said, is a desk review to review the different policies that are implemented by government. And we are able to identify about 62 options. And then after this, we now called the different stakeholders within the consultative meetings that we had. And this actually was dominated by government, which advised on the policies that were a bit controversial on their side, that they felt they needed more information. So we were able to narrow down to 36 policy options that the different stakeholders came up with, but also in terms of where government needed more information and more engagements with the citizens. So that's how we arrived to this. Also, the whole process had government involvement right out from the start, and also during deliberation. We deliberately had government representatives, especially those that are managing these resettlement processes, so that they are able to respond and listen to what the citizens were raising, and also be part of the whole process, definitely for buying. And this was even across the local governments. How this can be looked at and linked to the broader audience, yes, this is a big question, but given that there was randomization in the process, first of all, is one checkpoint that we have. This is a random process where randomly selected citizens would participate in this. And also the opinions were further tested scientifically to make sure that the conclusions we are taking back to the government are actually scientifically proven. So that's one area. And then the opinions that came out were taken back to the citizens for further engagements to see whether it's communicating to what they identified. And so after this, we were able to get back to the communities in form of disseminations and also getting additional feedback on how best they would want most of these options implemented. So the whole process is really having a lot of participation of citizens, but also engagements with government to ensure that the identified options are mostly acceptable by different stakeholders.
Thank you for those great presentations. I am interested in finding out, I think building on to the last question, a little bit more detail in terms of your selection of participants in the deliberative processes, because I think one of the key issues that often gets to arise is how do you incorporate the voices of the marginalized, the young, for example, the women, for example. I'm thinking, for example, with the Ugandan example, how did you managed to incorporate, you know, because when I looked at some of the reasons as to why people would always come back to the risk areas, I was trying to listen, for example, to young women's voices in those reasons. What exactly were they able to share, and how were you able to incorporate their voices in the process? Same for Ireland.
Thank you. Great question. There's quite a few people who want to come in. There's one on this table, then one on the back, and several on the back. So let's start with this table, and then we'll work our way backwards and then around the room.
And just to say, we are aware that many of you are saying or feeling that it's gone too cold now, and we're working to fix it. A lot of extra layers.
I don't know. Keeps people moving, I think. Right. Sorry. Carry on.
Thanks for the presentations. I have a question to Andre, because like making lawmaking process is transparent is one thing, but understanding law is another thing. As I have an academic background in law, I always considered myself as a translator to the citizens. Are there any initiatives to translate the sophisticated legal language to the citizens?
Okay, great question. And then we'll go to the table behind you, and then we'll come to the other two tables who want to ask questions in the next round.
Hello all, my name is Abduhab. I'm working with UNDP Somalia. I want to ask a very specific question to my colleagues from Uganda, the way we used to see the institutions that always support the public policy were mainly dominated by non-Africans before, but now things are changing, and I'm very happy to see that we have local organizations that are primarily working the local people who knows the context very well, who are developing IDs, all of that. But I still feel that there's a bit gap specifically on what you have presented was more like an assessment that was being made to influence policy, but I don't think that it's more innovative, and here we want to see maybe that we can say this is a model that worked, innovative model that worked, that can be replicated in, let us say, in other African countries or Asian countries, other than the assessment or consultation with people and producing papers. What we're still missing is a unique, innovative models, experimentations that are maybe ready for a scale up. So if you can think about more like how could you ensure that whatever you produce, it's also equivalent and turns to a models and experimentations.
Okay, thank you. Were there any other questions on that table before we? Right, in which case I know I'm going to take you at the start of the next round. We've got one quick one here, and then we're going to.
Actually, two very short questions. Many thanks for presentation. Very short, especially to Ireland, and another example is to what extent this approaches in Ireland. This is the third edition of Citizen Assembly. To what extent these approaches can be institutionalized? Should they complement officially in a way or supplant maybe some of the functions of the national decision making? Maybe instead of councils of elderly, we should have councils of randomly. And the second question is about to what extent we can reapply this approach to the global issues at the global stage.
Excellent short questions. I'm going to ask our panelists for short answers. So just a quick reminder, the scalability and replicability, the global availability of it, how do you handle representation, how do you handle people who are harder to reach, and how do you handle really technical issues? So, Andreas.
So I guess I have two responses to your questions. So first of all, transparency in itself, unless you're a political scientist like me, doesn't have a value, a practical value. So something has to come out of that. So there needs to be about participation, accountability, whatever. So I think there's two responses. One is there's intermediaries or infomediaries, as they're called, who translate difficult to understand topics to citizens, basically. So when you look at the example from Indonesia, Gerrit Archer did exactly that. So we're able to break down very complex issues on permits and mining and tax payments of taxes by companies and all of that in a easy to understand way. The second response is, and then I probably hand over to Jane, is what you can see in the Citizen Assembly initiative, that citizens actually are able to understand very complex issues and even complicated policy-making processes and laws. And I understand that the language that lawyers use or policy advisors is sometimes quite complicated, but I think these sort of initiatives and others show, really well that actually citizens can engage and understand these complicated topics.
Thank you so much for the questions and comments. One is on the selection of participants. Yes, again, it goes to the randomization process. If we went to a household, the qualification to participate in this was 18 years and above. So if we went to a household that had over 5 people who could qualify for this, we would do a randomization to make sure that there is a chance of everyone being able to participate in this. And we ended up actually having, in all the polls, we've had, the one in Butareja, we had 52% female, and then 48 males. In Bududa, it was the same. And we had about 27% young people. We also had some people with disabilities represented, but through this randomization process. So that's quickly how I can comment on this. But the beauty with this is the randomization, and that's a scientifically proven method that you're able to make everyone represented in this process. It also goes back to the question my colleague asked on this being more of an assessment, not a model. I think this is a model. The question we are answering here is, what are the best methods we can engage citizens? Because apparently it's more of opinion leaders. Most of the governments, whenever they want to get an opinion on any policy-related issue, they just identify opinion leaders. But the opinions of these opinion leaders may not necessarily represent the whole population. So the question is, how do we get a more representation of citizens to participate in policy formulation? And this is the question and the model that we are presenting, that there are scientifically proven methods that we can use. And this has been piloted across. We've done this in about 5 countries now in Africa. And across the globe, I think the relative polls have been done in over 27 countries. So this is a process that has been applied both in the developing and the developed world, and we are seeing the different results coming in this. And this also goes to the aspect of the globalization of this process. I think we've already tested this in the different settings. It's now a matter of how do we institutionalize this in the different countries. We have countries that are having early discussions on how they can take up this as a model for consultation, and the discussions are now ongoing. We've already had also discussions in Uganda with government on how this can be institutionalized. The question is now on the cost component, because this is more of a scientific process that requires a more budget than the usual way of consultation. So those are now the issues that we are currently discussing with the different governments where this has been done.
Okay, so thanks. Yeah, so I'll try to be brief because some of us will do. I think I agree that the key is that it's random, we're actually at some of your colleagues in the constitution making unit in New York of the UNDP had a group of us who do these experiments a few weeks ago there, and one of their key questions was, well, especially in other countries in Africa or Asia, there could be a culture where young women mightn't always be given voice and so on. So the randomization allows that. So it kind of explicitly can allow in people who otherwise mightn't be given voice, and that's why it's important that it is random citizens and not representatives of groups or of communities, not interest groups, no matter how well-meaning the interest group, that it must be random. In terms of technical, our citizens looked at all sorts of technical things. They find it easier to deal with ones which are to do with fundamental values. So if you're going to do a technical issue, we did electoral reform. Canada did electoral systems. They took 8 months over one issue because you have to have an education thing. You can't just go in and do like a deliberative poll. Like this model takes 1 weekend. You can't, you couldn't do a deliberative poll with anything technical because you know you have to be able to build up knowledge. So it is a matter of time to be able to do that kind of thing. And in terms of the institutional supplanting, there is a group of kind of sortition people who would really like to see, they're trying to argue with us that like our upper house of parliament, that the Shannon should be a sortition assembly rather than a representative assembly. But I think what we generally try to argue back is that actually this is a process that aids representative government and it isn't there to supplant it. And what you want are these randomly selected citizens who are coming in for short periods of time and dealing. You don't want them institutionalized, and because then you're going to get internal politics within there, you're going to get groupthink and all sorts of things. So I think the kind of in and out works much better rather than new institutions supplanting representative ones.
That's great, thank you. We have some questions on the table and the back, and some here as well. I'm going to take that table first. I'm going to run down here. If there's anyone on that table, this is one table over there. So start there, and then we'll go down here. Please keep your questions short. The more you're interrogating, the less we're deliberating.
Sure. Okay. So I was wondering whether we can reflect a bit more on the intersection between deliberative processes and technological innovation. And I think there are at least two angles that are worth exploring in my mind. One aspect is how technology can enhance the deliberative process. For instance, computer-based modeling. It's an excellent way to get a handle on the complexity of policy making, can help simulate the effect of different policy options, can bring out trade-offs.
This is feeling like an excellent start to the table discussion, but can you keep the question short?
Sure. So, but it's not used that way. So is there merit and scope to change that? The second aspect is how the deliberative process itself can be used as a way to assess technology, or for people to think through the implication of technology, potentially as an input into regulation.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Let's go to the table at the back, unless there's anyone else on that table. No, okay, great, table at the back.
Thank you. I'm Marina from UNDP Armenia office. My question is about this lawmaking process. Actually, in Armenia, we have a platform that is called e-draft, and any draft law can go to parliament before it is on this platform for 2 weeks for public discussion. But the point is whether it is meaningful discussion or not, because everyone can go there freely and make their comments, but the first issue is that they don't know when the new draft will come. There is no announcement about this. And the second is that the government often says, this is not accepted, this is not accepted, and you never have a meaningful answer. So somehow this participation is very formalistic, and civil society is really complaining about this. So my point is how to make this participation really meaningful. Maybe we should look for the ways of how to make this really work. And the second goes for the citizen participation. Again, you have spoken about so many recommendations. My question is, what is the follow-up on implementation of recommendations? Because there have been so many recommendations done in so many ways. And again, civil society in Armenia is complaining, saying that they participate very often, they provide full list of recommendations, but then no one pays attention to this because government says, we didn't have time, this was not important, and so on and so on. So my question is, follow-up on recommendations, how we do it? Thank you.
Excellent question. Thank you very much. One more person on that table, and we'll come to the next. Yeah.
So my question is to Dublin's Citizens Assembly. Actually, I'll just keep it short. Is your data accessible? Is your assembly accessible for people with disabilities? How do you include people with disadvantaged areas? And also, do you experience any conflicts in these assemblies coming out of different opinions, different ideas? If you do, how do you handle it?
Great question, thank you. Let's move on to this next table here. Just that way.
Marcus Brand, UNDP, Ukraine. First of all, thank you for the really good, interesting presentations. Very useful inspiration, good details. I just want to say that to me, the issue of participation and participatory approaches is not a new thing. For UNDP, it's not a new thing. Actually, it's governance 101 that we've done for the last 15, 20 years in many different contexts. I remember 10 years ago with Minako, we were doing participatory constitution building in Nepal with 300,000 people participating. My question is, and except maybe minus the fancy technology that we now have access to. My question really, and this also to us in UNDP, is why can we not get beyond this telling stories about individual success stories, and yours are very valuable, and why can we not say, yes, of course, that's what we do, that's what we mean with democratic governance, that's what we mean with democratic participation, how do we scale it up? So for me, that is the big question of why do we have to relearn this and re-explain this all the time?
I think it's a great question. I'm going to stop you there because it's also something I want to come back to at the end, because if we haven't answered that question, or at least made a start, then we are not
Thank you. I was wondering about the weight of the specialists that implement those processes or that drive these processes. How do you do in order that they don't influence the process? And do you think there is a bias by those same specialists?
Okay, great. We have one question here and then one at the back, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw a line. Oh, sorry. Go.
Thank you for the presentation. It's on optimality of engagement and uptake of the perspectives, because there is two visions, two angles of direct participation by the citizens themselves, as well as representative participation by your institutions as civil society organizations. Of course, you possess the knowledge, the technologies, the ability to analyze. The public, on the other hand, need to appreciate the laws that are being designed. They have a bit of indigenous knowledge. Which model in your analysis would work best?
Okay, great question. There was a quick comment here, and then we're going to go to the back.
Just a little comment regarding randomization of the processes in order to assure participation or real effective participation of different populations. As we've learned in the experience of participatory processes, sometimes it's good to do a little affirmative actions to actually ensure the effective participation of populations. Maybe not in Ireland, but in Latin America we have a lot of indigenous populations, and that's complicated. So affirmative action is just in the scope.
Okay, last point. Let's keep it really short.
There's 2 points here, but I think it's great we're reminding ourselves again of the importance of citizen participation, even though we know it. I think we so much focus on institutions, so this is great panel. My question is, in my region, in the Arab states, a large part of the population is youth, and they're engaged a lot more actively through social media. So did you consider elements of social media in the design of your programs? Why or why not did you rely on it?
Great stuff, thank you. If you can keep it to 3 words, go.
Yeah, we have SDGs, and you know, all of this discussion is going to all these traditional governance approaches. So if we go for randomization and, you know, all this ad hoc approaches, we might risk leaving everyone behind, you know, just like a big chunk of population is there. So
okay,
thank
that's
you.
great. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to just don't answer everything. Do not attempt to answer everything. There's so much richness there, which we'll come to in the discussions. Pick up a couple of key points, and then we're going to start talking.
Okay, so, well, I suppose the last 2 are most freshly in my head. So randomization, I think it is important. I see what you mean by affirmative action, but I think what you need to do is decide, well, we need to have quota for people with disabilities or people of different ethnicities or people in different groups, and then they must be picked randomly and not be, you know, from interest groups. And then in terms of being accessible, yeah, absolutely. So everything was signed, everything was in a couple of languages, and it was fully accessible. And we had a big social media campaign, and everything was live streamed out on Twitter and Facebook. And finally, the experts and specialists, it's a great question. The first time we chose everybody, and then we figured we were in danger of actually overly influencing it. So in the next ones for each different topic, then different groups of experts were brought together to discuss who might be the experts, and then the citizens voted on who they were, and they were brought in to take away our possible biases.
Thank you so much. I think I will not necessarily focus on answering questions, but probably some of the comments raised are good when it comes to the table discussions, especially on how we can use technology to enhance these deliberations. This is a question that I don't have an answer for as of now, but probably maybe it's something that we can discuss. And we hope this probably would help in improving this. Then the other aspect is how do we move beyond individual success stories as UNDP probably to be able to take this beyond. And I think the discussions tomorrow would be also focusing on how some of these case studies would be strengthened in terms of the way forward. And there are some sessions tomorrow focusing on taking these experiments beyond the discussions we've had. Thank you.
So a quick observation and a quick response. So one is we've sort of shifted conversation from power and decision making to citizen participation. But to me, there's so much more to power and decision making. So how do you empower individuals to make better decisions and choices? How do you hold the powerful to account? And also, I'd like us to broaden the discussion again, when we have the group discussions. That's just a quick observation. So a quick response on scalability or replication of experiments. We had a discussion yesterday and this morning that how do you make sense of this? How do you scale an experiment that has worked in one country and another one? I think going back to my final slide, there's three sort of principles or components that might be valuable to reflect on, which was about what are the rules of the game, what technology can be used, and who do you need to engage. I think too often we think about scale as something as we take it from one part of the world and replicate it in another part. I think we need to move beyond or go beyond that. And actually, the first particle lawmaking approach was applied at a EU level to find out how the travel budget of commissioners has been spent. So it can be replicated, but it was a similar context with similar sort of preconditions.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for all your questions. We've already started some of the discussions and some of the thinking. But one thing I want to leave you with before I ask Jos to remind you of the process here is that power is not participation, and this session is about power. Participation is useless if it is not connected to cultures, practices, and structures that enable that participation to be meaningful. That's one thing I would like you to think about. Don't focus on the participation when you can be focusing on the power, and don't focus on the decisions when you can be focusing on the governance. But Joost, quick introduction or reminder of what people need to do, and then we'll get discussing.
You are already more or less familiar with the process, and I just wanted to kind of pick up on some of what I've heard in the room very briefly, which is to recognize that each of you individually is working in a very different context on very different issues and from very different starting points. For some people, the detail of what was being presented is particularly relevant. Other people are essentially voicing their frustration that as an organization we need to move on. Both of these responses are correct because both of them reflect individual situations within your particular context, whether that is a country office or one of the regional hubs, etc. Right? All of these responses are valid, and I think we need to work with all of them to move on as an organization in our particular context of work. So what that means that I want to remind you of is that this is really about both you and your particular work in the near future, and then of course also about UNDP and how it moves forward as an organization. So when you work now for a few minutes individually around the projects and ideas and principles that seem particularly relevant to you, that is really that question. What do you think are the things that stand out to you individually as where we need to make the shift? Right? And that might be about very technical, particular processes, or about that question of scale and moving on as an organization, right? And I really want you to connect to your sense of urgency with that. And then the second point is when you share in a later stage, this is not about coming up with one sort of table consensus of ideas. We will be working with a multiplicity of ideas going forward, naturally. That's normal. And that also means that these might not be things exclusively within UNDP, but also processes that UNDP can support externally in the context that you're working in. So that's another point. And I really wanted you to get started now. Take a moment, as we have been listening and talking and voicing questions, take a moment individually to reflect on what you think are the most relevant principles for you. And what are the ideas that stand out for you that you could be doing. And then we'll move on from there. Now, let me just, a quick show of hands. The table hosts and co-facilitators that we've got, are they on all tables? No, not entirely, but more or less. We will be...
I think we have two on the middle table, so maybe if one can move over here.
Okay. Can one of you move? Is that great?
Okay. You have one over here. Okay.
Which table doesn't seem to...
Which table does not have...
Is hostless. Okay, fine. You're good. Great. Okay. And I think there we're good as well. Okay, we're good? Great, fantastic. Okay, so individually for a good 5 minutes, and then we move on. Thank you. And if at this point you might have lost your playbook, which might be the case, feel free to go straight to the mat where there's lots of space as well to be written on. I don't think we do at this point. I'll check, but we might not, and then people just go straight to the mat. everybody, as we are heading to a close, you'll have about 3-4 more minutes. And remember, what we're asking you to write down is not one group idea. It's actually to recognize that there's many ideas that will be relevant in different contexts. So put those down on the mats in an ideal world. Don't feel like you have to come up with a singular proposal. And then we'll work with the multiplicity of ideas in the wrap-up session. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to draw to a conclusion what from the buzz in the room and from going around the tables I know are really great conversations. But what I want to try and do is to draw together some of the ideas that you've been having and try and let us leave here with a few thoughts that are not just individual ideas. Because one of the things I'm really keen to understand is how the different tables and the different conversations have connected. Because I think, not to go on too much, but I think the UNDP is a really interesting organisation in lots and lots of ways. And I think this session for the UNDP is particularly interesting. And the reason it's particularly interesting is that what we're talking about is how you, as an organisation, inspire action in networks, while also being an organisation that exists as a networked organisation. So to some extent, what you're trying to do in citizens and in those networks of power and governance are the same things that you're trying to do internally as an organisation. So it's the same combat. I'd be really interested to hear what's going on. So I'm going to pick a table at random. And when you listen to what the table is saying about the ideas and thoughts they came up with, think about how it connected to your table, because I'm not going to just go around the room, because that's really boring. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a random table. In fact, I'm going to start with this table here. And then I'm going to ask someone who is inspired or has a connection with their table's conversation from what this table thought about, and we'll try and build up the connections as we go. So, go. Have we got a... Yes, we have a... Yeah. Just coming.
Okay, guys, so you'll help me out, but we had a discussion on how do you build capacity in governance structure for deliberate processes. That would be how is it possible to install within government the understanding of inclusive governance. That could be through policy design, that could be how do we implement the SDGs within the strategic framework, and how do we do that with the relevant stakeholders, and also installing the capacity among the stakeholders to actually do that and build. And we were sort of thinking about what's the infrastructure for that. There are a lot of experience from that in terms of policy design, but also to include people in the deliberation of both analytics on problems, but also how to make inclusive policies.
So can I ask you to draw out two separate things here? So capacity is sometimes used to talk about capability. It's used to talk about your ability to do something. But capacity also means, are there the people around you who can make it happen? Are there enough people in the organization or out in the world? Which one of those were you talking about, or were you talking about both?
I think we started with capability, to build the capability, but then you also need people to do it. So, yeah, so... Okay.
So one point here about capacity and one point here about capability. Which other table was talking about some of those things? Who was worrying that they didn't have the skills in the organisation or in the people that they were working with? And who was worrying that there just weren't enough people? I saw a hand at the table behind. There you go. You see, that's what happens. Yes, yeah, that table there.
I was just waving. Sorry. We are much far beyond those capacities.
So, okay, over at the table at the back there and here as well. So let's go over here. And so what struck you about that conversation about capacity and capability?
Maybe just to continue, not in relation to capacity, but also like we have been discussing the youth engagement and youth participation into this all decision-making processes. And we thought that maybe to engage youth, we should speak their language. For example, we should not use the traditional methods of sharing information of the boring work that the governments do, but that influences the future generation, but rather, for example, to use maybe Instagram or Snapchat or something else, the language that is so popular among the youth, so that they get engaged into the process. As far as I started, I will continue. The second thing that we discussed is about participation and power. Is that the participation of citizens should not be only through recommendations or through gathering together and discussing something, but also for voting, for example. If you are voting for a particular politician or a party, it should be an informed voting. So maybe there should be some scorecards for politicians that eventually will provide objective information to the citizens about how this politician is making the decisions, how he is providing feedback, and how he is behaving generally, how he is using the official resources for personal interests, and so on. So, and finally, we have been also discussing the alternative future spotting. For example, what if we take the recent 10 years recommendations, random selection, and we make kind of data mining into it, and then analysis, and see where we could have been if we have implemented the recommendations. And this can be also reflected on the SDGs. We are saying that it is not we cannot implement the SDGs by 2030, but maybe we could have already implemented them should we have implemented the recommendations.
Yeah. I think there's some really interesting points there about capacity and capability as well, because you're asking some quite technical things. How do I use Instagram? How do I use Snapchat? I mean, like, I use Instagram, but I use it really badly. So I'm not suggesting you do it like I do it. But what are the technical ways you can do that? But also, youth engagement and talking people's language is not a skill that comes naturally to people who work in big organizations. So in terms of capacity and capability, I wonder whether the partnerships that you're building and the skills that you have in the team are going to be enough, and what are the ways in which the UNDP as an organization can build those up. Because I think that partnerships and how you're trying to connect things across horizontally is one of the interesting things I was picking up as I went around the table. I'm going to come to this table here because they had something to pick up on the capacity and capability point as well. But I don't want to lose what you were saying there about youth engagement and the importance of speaking the right language.
Here in the group, we also discussed about the capacity and capability. And in fact, we said the capacity in overall as well. Basically, we thought that capacity is not only the capability, but also the sort of like from the term of citizens' responsibility. Because we heard about the case in South Korea where the government was willing to set up a platform, the forum, for the sort of as a recourse mechanism for the citizens being able to provide their complaints, and the government, is it 100,000? If there would be 100,000 votes, the government is required to respond and to react. And then actually it was misused in a way because there was some kind of like some requests that were not really sort of I guess more ridiculous, I would say, request about the complaint about some of the, I think it was Music Star or yeah. So, but basically, I mean, it was misuse of that platform. So I think it's also an issue of like educating. Because we are stepping up in a new era, completely new in the governance because of the new technology and the and again, colleagues here mentioned about the youth who actually been raised now with the using, social media and the technology. So that's why we have to think about it, setting up maybe new rules, educating, and setting up this the notion of citizen responsibility and engagement. So through the social media. We also talked about the use of the social media as a platform for the engagement of the government directly with the citizens, so they can hear directly from them, and it will be and something that's already happening. But again, I mean, it's. It depends from like their interest and particular individual interest, but now it should become more sort of an real sort of engine and mechanism for the governance.
That's great.
Yeah.
So, Marion.
Yeah, just adding from the other side of the table, which was related to Zimbabwe, on social media as well, that social media should never ever be another way to broadcast, but that it's important to find out how policy items actually connect to the daily lives of people and the way they would phrase their daily concerns. And actually, citizen consultations there can be a way to figure that out, to validate with citizens what their daily concerns and lives are and how that connects to government, and make sure there is a clear link between the offline and the online strategy, but that the online strategy is very much also based on a conversation and reaching out to people where they are having the conversation and how they're having it.
So, thank you. So who was picking up some of that conversation on social media, on technology? Over here.
Okay, so the conversation here shifted a bit to engagement from the regular perspective of us engaging to the perspective of the persons targeted feeling engaged. I think the rule-making process assumes that there is interest in the public to participate in the first place. And the discussion here tried to understand why in certain instances young people is one demographic and indigenous people feel the need not to engage in the first place. The parameters of trust between themselves and the institutions of government, confidence to participate in the first place, and application of ICTs to stimulate that participation came out as areas where we can try, in at least to construct capabilities of engagement, feeling the necessity to participate in the rule-making process in the first place. So we found a significant correlation between such engagement catalyzed from the public itself to disruption of the power structures. Because shifting power to the people through effective and meaningful participation can alter perspectives of the rule-based rule-making process from a point of view of what we had before, capabilities to understand the rules in the first place, capabilities to see how implementation of the rules translates into substantive development changes to the public, and a sustained engagement that goes beyond mere making of rules to transformation that we saw in the presentation of the 5 countries across the region. So shifting engagement from what we think we can provide to stimulating engagement from the public wanting to feel part of development that concerns them.
So one more comment on that table very quickly, and then I want to just pick up.
Just to add a little bit, and maybe sometimes because of the context are so different, sometimes we're concentrating in social media to include the youth, but what's going on with the old technologies, right? That's something we have to mix these new technologies with old technologies in order to be able to link these people that are right now digitally not literate, right? So what's going on with radio, what's going on to other things, we shouldn't leave aside that.
I think that's really important, and I think your point about disruption is great as well, but it made me think, well, I'm really looking forward to your meeting with the government. You go, guys, I've got this great idea. We're going to totally disrupt and undermine your power structures. You're up for that, right? You're in on that? Brilliant, let's do it. Because actually there's quite a lot of things in that people feel they lose control over. So one of our questions, I think, is how do you hold enough control so that you can give reassurance, while not holding so much control you're suffocating all of the opportunities for innovation, which is something I want to come back to. But let's go to this table now.
Just picking up on technology and on combining digital, analog, and a variety of other approaches, I have to admit we took advantage of the opportunity that a number of us here are from the same country office and already started crafting a pilot. I know that was not the idea, but yeah, just to speak the truth to people. And what we discussed a sort of a focused piloting of a range of different participation arrangements, but again, not losing sight of the topic of power, right? And looking at the choice of issue and the choice of what to discuss, and not participation for participation's sake, but to ensure that we start from a point where there's a real problem that exists. Because I think from the presentations that we heard, it's very unlikely that a government will develop the skills and the capabilities and so on to engage and to interact when it doesn't face a problem around something. So picking up on an issue where there is a real need to do something differently, and then the risks are also kind of already on the table. And then piloting a range of different initiatives. So one would be the kind of maybe a slightly adjusted citizen assembly model, but then combining that with technology tools for digital participation that in essence have to be more superficial and kind of broader than the kind of in-depth engagement that we can see from this. The other way in which we would like to pilot this and include technology is to ensure that whatever issue is being addressed, that there is a sort of data stream related to that includes public data by necessity, of course, but then also if there are some other sources that could be important for decision making and for deliberation, that ensuring that technology is used in all of the ways that it's possible to use in that sense. And then combining this also with the public hearings that we do with municipal assemblies, on which Biljana can say a few words if she wants.
Okay. So we've been piloting a lot with National Assembly, mobile committee sessions, taking the MPs outside and bringing citizens for public hearings, which will be different than the British Parliament has. But it enabled a lot of things to be moved and certain amendments to be reached and kind of push things forward, especially taking the parliamentarians out to the local level and kind of brainstorming with local citizens. I mean, it's a formal session, but the citizens were allowed to participate, give their ideas, civil society. So we made breakthrough and reached certain results, and now we took that down to the local level. So we are working with local assemblies and trying to organize hearings there. We pushed forward for the amendments, so the law on local assemblies now has the amendments to enable public hearings, but we also want to put these MPs at the local level to meet with citizens and address certain issues.
Right, and I'll stop you there because it's really there's something really interesting I want to draw out
to
of
say that
yeah,
it's kind of bringing together the decision makers' power and the participation.
Yes, that's exactly what exactly the point I was going to make. But also I was going to say it's really interesting to have a practical example, because one of the things that I bet you were all thinking when you were hearing what was being said there about what's happening in Serbia is, yeah, I could do that. Yeah, that could work for us. That could work in the place that I'm in. So what are the ways in which the team in Belgrade can work with you? What are the ways in which you can work with them? What are the ways in which you can create the kind of the common project around the things that you share, while still respecting the fact that you're all working in really different contexts and on really different problems? That's one of the things I think is a real challenge, and something I suspect we won't answer now, but it feels like one of the really important questions. So let's go to the table behind.
Actually, we started with the question and the discussion what will not work in our communities, and then started to discuss some solutions, which are mainly about the monitoring and reporting, which will lead to an action, meaning that this will lead to the governance by the citizens, which was a solution suggested by one of our colleagues from Georgia, which is car GPS. To monitor where are the officials going, and to not every car, not every car. We know about the security issues and stuff, we discussed it. And we also discussed the feedback loop, because the government knows what he's doing and somehow delivers the information he wants, but the citizens that doesn't have the opportunity to give the feedback, and we sort of want to create a tool which will create this feedback loop between the governments and the citizens. And we had some things connected with the technology and participatory governance and stuff like this, in terms of outsourcing the call centers, because the citizens and call centers to the NGOs or the citizens, because these both communities understand each other much more better than the government and the citizens, or the citizens and the government. And we wanted to also sort of buy the content from the citizens themselves with the validation from the government. But in terms of the capability, we also discussed the things that there is a problem in the data sphere, because in lots of countries, there is no formats to collect the data. There is no proper mechanism to preserve the data, and the most importantly, to analyze the data, because we are creating the tools to engage the citizens and to collect some ideas, but what's happening next? For example, we have the recommendations from the citizens or the opinions. What is next? That's the issues we discussed.
That's a really interesting point, and it picks up something that we haven't talked about much, which is around the governance side, because actually being able to see what's going on, the transparency and having accountability over the process, just as important parts of this power and governance agenda as participation. In some ways, they're more important because they give proof that what is being participated on will have some kind of accountability and some feedback mechanism. There's a few tables who haven't contributed yet. Would one of them like to pick up on one of those points, or even reflect on one of the things that have been said already? Yes, go over here.
Really quickly, because I think everybody's ready to go to lunch. So based on our multinational gender unbalanced discussion, we've come to the following conclusions. We also had very similar discussions, like all the other groups, about translating legal language into something that any citizen could understand, and about feedback loops. But for us, we started with the context that we have saturation with platforms in many local communities where we work. We are faced with low participation rates, and we had to address contextual relevance. So somewhere In smaller local communities, digital would definitely not work because citizens could meet a mayor on the street and get their issue addressed over coffee, maybe. And elsewhere, for us, maybe more of the discussion revolved around inclusion, representation, and access. So we worked on principles of co-design. So it would, if we would like to have a dialogue or a public consultation process include people with disabilities, could we co-design a solution with people with disabilities that could maybe be digital, we don't know, that could be integrated on the local website where they would have access to information and be able to have their voices heard. And we also addressed motivation. So for us, motivation was, the discussion on motivation was revolving around the fact that many times when the government invites the civil society, those are generally pre-screened, pre-selected civil society organizations, but how do we make sure that the rest of them know what's going on if that information is available? And the question is, how do we make sure that local success stories are promoted? So that would affect people being motivated to show up the next time that otherwise never do.
Great stuff, thank you. So I think there's 2 more tables left to contribute. Am I right? Which tables haven't contributed? I think this one and that one, yeah. Okay, so if we go to this table first, can I ask you to keep it short? Who's got the mic? Yeah. Yeah. If you keep it short, I just want, otherwise we will actually not get to lunch, and that will be sad.
We have talked many issues related to the theme, but one thing that's pretty much related to what other colleagues in the other tables have mentioned was the power in relation, or when we are talking about youth specifically. We have talked about how what we call the consultation processes, mainly done by UN and other agencies, not that effective, and doesn't mainly lead to more proactive engagement, and how we can change that dynamic, specifically when program or research is related to the youth and all of that, or policy related that's been mainly done by selected people, like in consultation with that, but that doesn't give a power to the youth. So should we get more representative approaches and experimentations that can work more, that gives the youth a space not only to participate, but also to drive power and have that discussions. Yeah.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Okay, this is the last table, so you're going to have to give us an energy boost, a springboard into that post-lunch dip. Go.
Microphone. Yeah, so we had a very similar conversation to lots of the other tables around here. I think maybe we'll just quickly talk a little bit about disruption and choice of projects, especially in totalitarian situations. And looking at, we basically said that on top of, building incremental interest through local participation, so looking at projects that help to do that, we need to also have a portfolio of tools and mechanisms to stop elite capture. And so one idea we had, perhaps, working with any of the colleagues around the table to build globally some sort of power mapping tool, which would help us to determine. In fact, there is already in existence a power mapping tool, so refining it for a UNDP context. Would anyone else around the table like to add anything?
Well, I can just add that even UNDP already has one. It's called Institutional and Context Analysis. It was prepared about 10 years ago by the Oslo Governance Center, and it's a useful piece of text to refer to every once in a while. I hope so.
Okay, I thought that was what a great way to finish, because what we've talked about in that last session is something that we want to do and something that you're already doing, and they're both the same thing. And that for me is the perfect summary of what we've been talking about here, because so many of these conversations have been similar, and that's not a criticism. They've been similar because you're facing the same challenges, and the range of things that you can do is also relatively limited. So there are maybe 6 or 7 meta projects in this room that are like UNDP-wide, but look different in different places because different places look different. So there's one around how do you understand participation as a method? What do you do to make it better? There's one around how do you connect those voices into power and how do you make sure that they know they're being listened to. There's one that's about how do you reach the people who you might not hear from or who might not have the confidence to speak up. Young people, those from minorities, those from groups that are not traditionally represented in power structures. There's one about technology. You know, we all have far too many platforms. I have about 900 inboxes. I keep missing messages. But how do you manage that? How, in a world where there's lots of digital action, how do you put it all together? How do you use the places where people are on social media? What are the things that you can do to join that up? And most importantly for me, what's the way in which the communities of people across the UNDP are working with each other, but also with people in country and with people globally to try to develop some of those things as continuing learning experiences, rather than a piece of research or a tool that sits on a shelf and that people remember because someone used it once and it's a good tool. So those sorts of bits of learning and those bits of knowledge management, they're always essential. They're even more essential in a networked world. And one of the things that I hope we can talk about this afternoon is what are the ways in which we can make those work as partnerships within UNDP, between UNDP and outsiders in country, and between UNDP and outsiders globally. Thank you so much to the three presenters who spoke earlier, to Jane, to Nathan, and to Andreas. Thank you to you very much for participating. Do enjoy your lunch.